Welcome to our second session here of the SOS Couples course, the goal of which is to focus on the idea of marriage, to try and invest in our marriages in a godly way, to pursue God's design for marriage. And so glad to have you back. Let's go ahead, begin with a word of prayer, then we'll kind of recap where we left off last time. We're going to pick it up from there and start working our way, continuing our way through the book of the Song of Songs. And so let's go to the Lord in prayer, and then we'll jump in. Gracious Father, thank you so much for the time today. Lord, thank you for this precious book, the Song of Songs, that is our template for marriage. We ask that, Lord, you would guide and direct our thoughts. Lord, my speech as we work our way through this divinely inspired handbook on marriage. We ask that you would encourage us, challenge us, help us, Lord, to invest in our marriages, to repair our marriages if need be, so that, Lord, we can live a life that honors and glorifies your Son, Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. Okay, well, just by way of quick recap where we left off last time, we recall the major theme of the book. The major theme of the book, the Song of Songs, is maturing or advancing love. We looked at those three key passages, chapter 2, verse 16, chapter 6, verse 3, and chapter 7, verse 10. Those three main verses form really the theme of the book, where Shulamite, who is the primary speaker, character, the story, the song is largely written from her perspective. We see her advancing and maturing in her relationship with Solomon. She goes from a very clingy, selfish, self-oriented sort of love to then a selfless, sacrificial form of love, which is, of course, the ultimate goal in marriage, is to become other-oriented, or spouse-oriented rather than self-oriented. And that's God's design for marriage, and we see that is the path of growth and maturity that takes place in the life of Shulamite, and of course that is what ultimately brings about the peace and security in the marriage between Solomon and Shulamite. Now, this outline, not original with me, but nonetheless, it is a helpful, for me, one of my favorite ways to outline the book and to show the plot line of the book. The first two chapters, recall, is all about the pursuit of love. That is, they're in the courtship stage. And my goal is to try and get through a good chunk of that here today. Then, of course, we see chapter 3 of the book is the promise of love. That is the wedding itself. That is the wedding ceremony. Chapter 4 would be the wedding night. That is the pleasures of love. That's their first sexual encounter. And then, of course, we're going to see the latter half of the book, the chapters 5 to 8, is the problems of love. Their first fight will occur in chapter 5, and then, of course, they will learn how to climb out of that, to repair their marriage, and their relationship will be stronger as a result of that. And so that is a very practical section for us as we talk about working through the problems of marriage. So recall last time, if you were with us, then recognize that the first 6 verses of the book is really the opening scene to the book, is Shulamite's first visit to Jerusalem, where she comes and she arrives and she is brought to the chambers or the palace of the king. And recall, she's a city. This is her first visit to the city. She's a country girl up from the regions of Lebanon. Well, she comes down south to the region of Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem. She's visiting there, and the scene opens with really giving us a glimpse into her thoughts and longings. She says, recall, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for his love is better than wine. And she is speaking and longing for Solomon. And she's obviously attracted to him, both physically, but more importantly, the character of Solomon has attracted her. Well, then we see her in verses 5 and 6 of chapter 1. She addresses the daughters of Jerusalem. That would be the city girls that are located there, the eligible women living in the city of Jerusalem. And recall that she defends her beauty. She says, I'm black but comely, O you daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon, and on she goes. But the point is, we talked about at the end of last time, and this was your homework, was to identify your insecurities and where they are rooted even deeper into your identity. And I tried to get you to think through some of those things. What are your insecurities? What are your fears? What areas do you exhibit self-doubt? But then go further, and what is it that you are holding to as a false identity? And then we talk through just trying to find personal security, which will then help you find marital security. And so that was your homework last time. Well, today we're going to pick up the story in Song of Solomon chapter 1, and this is what we're going to do. We're going to read from chapter 1 verse 7 down to chapter 2 verse 7. And what we're basically going to see, we're going to read it in a moment, but you're going to see this scene develop is that Shulamite longs for time with Solomon. That's the first chunk here, verse 7. Well, Solomon arranges time with Shulamite, and as they get together, they display a healthy sort of chemistry. They exchange good compliments one to another. And this sort of healthy chemistry is actually instructional for us. It's going to introduce to us what you might have heard of before, the 5 love languages, and the ways, the means by which we demonstrate affection one to another. We send and receive affection. And we need to understand this in a positive sense, because many marriages, the problem is that many marriages have failed to do this, or they have stopped doing this, and they no longer share affection one to another. They have stopped pursuing one another, and as a result of that, their marriage has stagnated, and it has brought on other issues. And so it's good for us to go back to this pursuit stage as we're witnessing their love story so that we can learn how to view ours in light of it. So with that said, let's begin by reading the text. If you got your Bibles, Song of Solomon, chapter 1, verse 7. Let's go to chapter 2, verse 7. It says this. Tell me, Shulamite speaking, tell me, O thou whom my soul loves, where you feed and where you make your flock to rest at noon. For why should I be as one that turns aside by the flocks of thy companions? If thou know not, this is Solomon's response to her, if you do not know, O thou fairest among women, go thy way forth by the footsteps of the flock, and feed your kids, or little goats, beside the shepherd's tents. I have compared you, O my love, to a company of horses in Pharaoh's chariots. Your cheeks are comely with rows of jewels, and your neck with chains of gold. We will make you borders of gold with studs of silver. While the king sits at his table, my spikenard sends forth the smell thereof. A bundle of myrrh is my well-beloved unto me. He shall lie all night betwixt my breasts. My beloved is unto me as a cluster of campfire in the vineyards of En-gedi. Behold, you are fair, my love. Behold, you are fair. You have dove's eyes. Behold, you are fair, my beloved. Yea, pleasant. Also our bed is green. The beams of our house are cedar, and our rafters of fir. I am the rose of Sharon and the lily of the valleys. As the lily among the thorns, so is my love among the daughters. As the apple tree among the trees of the wood, so is my beloved among the sons. I sat down under his shadow with great delight, and his fruit was sweet to my taste. He brought me to the banqueting house, and his banner over me was love. Stay me with flagons, comfort me with apples, for I am sick of love, or, as some translations will better put it, I am lovesick, I'm smitten. She says, verse 6, his left hand is under my head, his right hand doth embrace me. I charge you, O you daughters of Jerusalem, by the roes and by the hinds of the field, that you stir not up nor awake love till he pleases, or arouse passion until the time is right. Now, with that passage, let's just start working our way through it, and I want to acquaint you with the big ideas and what's going on, because as we said before, this is a song. And as a result, it can sometimes, especially if you're unacquainted with it, and you're unacquainted with who is speaking, it can be difficult to discern. Well, I'm going to walk you through it. Some Bible translations, some study Bibles, depending on what Bible you have, will attempt to give headings to who is speaking. It'll give you, the best guess of who is speaking. I'm going to follow those headings largely. Sometimes I'm going to depart from them because I'm going to disagree with them just slightly, but ultimately, those can be very helpful. And so let's just walk through it. Verse 7 is Shulamite speaking. And recall, the setting, this is her first visit to Jerusalem. She is a fish out of water, as we talked about last time. Well, she says in verse 7, tell me, O thou whom my soul loves, where do you feed, and where do you make your flocks to rest at noon? For why should I be as one that turns aside by the flocks of your companions? In other words, verse 7 is a clear expression of Shulamite wanting to have time with Solomon. She longs to be with him. That's why she's in the city of Jerusalem. But let's face it, Solomon is a busy guy. He is the king of Israel. And as a result, he has many responsibilities and duties, some of which are going to draw him away from time with Shulamite. However, she is insecure. She's in this spot. She's a fish out of water. She's in Jerusalem. She's only there because of Solomon. But nonetheless, apparently, there has been some sort of responsibility that has called Solomon away. In fact, she says, "Where are your flocks?" And according to the historic books, First Kings, as well as the book of Proverbs, we understand that Solomon was an owner of flocks, vast flocks. Apparently, he was out investigating those flocks and seeing the state of his flocks. As he warns in the book of Proverbs, it's wise for a man to know the state of his flocks. Well, apparently that's what Solomon is up to. Shulamite, who has been left alone perhaps in the palace, is now saying, "Hey, I want to get together with you. Why? I mean, boy, I want to spend time with you." She's longing for quality time with Solomon. So she says, "Where are you going to be?" "At noon. Let's set a time, and I'll come to you. But where are you going to be?" And this was probably referencing the common siesta that would be taken in Jewish culture in the flocks, the shepherds, etc., those who are working outdoors. During the heat of the day, when the high noon, they would often take a bit of a break until kind of getting to mid to late afternoon, when the breezes would kick up and it would be more manageable to work. So she says, "Hey, where are you going to be? I'll come to you during that time." Well, verse 8 is Solomon's somewhat coy response, but nonetheless, he's arranging a time for him and Shulamite to meet. He says in verse 8, "If you do not know, O thou fairest among women, go your way forth by the footsteps of the flock, and feed your kids beside the shepherd's tents." In other words, yes, here I'm going to be. Come follow the footsteps of the flock. In other words, they're arranging a meeting place. And the meeting place is, of course, she's coming to Solomon, perhaps because he's busy. But, maybe another conjecture some scholars throw out there is because, this is probably the royal couple, and they would be perhaps an area of interest for many of the inhabitants of Jerusalem, something akin to our modern paparazzi that would be following them around. And so perhaps it was hard for them to find time alone. But whatever the case might be, we see in verses 7 and 8 that they are arranging time to be together. We're going to come back and talk about that. But they're trying to involve and orchestrate quality time. Well, when they get together, verse 9 through 11 shows an interesting exchange of conversation. Solomon is the speaker here. He says in verse 9, "I have compared you, O my love, to a company of horses in Pharaoh's chariots. Your cheeks are comely with rows of jewels, your neck with chains of gold. We will make you borders of gold with studs of silver." Now, let me draw your attention especially to verse 9, when Solomon says, "You are like a filly or a female horse among the Pharaoh's Pharaoh's chariots." Now, this is definitely a cultural reference, and sometimes you're like, "Whoa, what in the world does that mean?" I mean, that's not that flattering to be compared to a horse. Well, think about this for a second. In this time and place, Solomon is making a reference here, a comparison between Shulamite and the being a filly amongst the chariots of Pharaoh. Now, what you and I might not be familiar with, but Solomon was, he was a horse trader, and he traded with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the Bible says. But what you and I might not be familiar with without a little background study is the fact that all of Pharaoh's chariots were drawn by stallions, male horses. Well, to be likened to a filly, or among the chariots of Pharaoh, is essentially, Solomon is saying to Shulamite, you are, quote, one of a kind. That you stand out. You're different than all the rest. That's what he's trying to say. That's the purpose. That's the main idea being communicated by this idiom. And so the point is, he's making a rather strong compliment to Shulamite. And he says, you are one of a kind. You stand out. You are the best of the best. He then goes on to compliment her accessories. That's what's going on in verse 10. He says, your cheeks are comely with rows of jewels, your neck with chains of gold. In other words, maybe you've seen pictures of this before, but in ancient Near Eastern cultures, Israel was no different. In fact, even to this day, there's many times women, when out in public, would wear veils. And it was a type of modesty. And this idea of the veil, sometimes the veil would be, there would be jewels on the veil. That's the whole idea of the cheeks are comely or beautiful with rows of jewels, and then apparently she's wearing some sort of necklace. He says, your neck with chains of gold. So in other words, he compliments her as a person, her character, verse 9. He then compliments her accessories, saying, wow, you look good this morning, right? You're just beautiful. Then verse 11 is basically a promise that he will make for her more accessories. He says, we will make you borders of gold with studs of silver. In other words, this is essentially a promise by Solomon to Shulamite that he wants to give her gifts. He wants to display his love and affection toward her by gift giving. We'll come back to that. But then, look at verse 12. It says, while the king sits at his table, my spikenard, Shulamite's now speaking. While the king sits at his table, my spikenard sends forth the smell thereof. A bundle of myrrh is my well-beloved unto me. He shall lie all night betwixt my breasts. My beloved is unto me as a cluster of camphire in the vineyards of En-gedi. Now in verses 12 to 14 here, Shulamite is speaking. We might have a change of scene, where apparently verses 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11, they were out with the flocks. They were spending some time together outside of the city of Jerusalem. But in verse 12, we have a scene change. She speaks of sitting at the king's table. Now, to sit at the king's table was a very special, specific reference in the ancient Near East, and it means to be on the king's payroll, or to be part of the king's cabinet, or to be part of the king's entourage. You are fed from off of the king's table. What the king himself eats, you eat. So it's quite possible that what's going on here is this might be, as some scholars call it, this would be Shulamites being launched onto high society, if you will. This might be a royal dinner that she is invited to. That could be what's going on. I think it's a good possibility. But if we're correct in analyzing the cultural norms of that day, Shulamite would not actually have been seated right next to Solomon, because they're not married yet. She's not the queen. More than likely, right next to him would be his general on one side, perhaps his right-hand side. On the left-hand side would be the queen mother, who, according to chapter 3, is still alive at this time. Solomon's mother is a lady the Bible calls Bathsheba, if you remember that story. But nonetheless, more than likely, Shulamite is not seated directly next to Solomon, but she's sitting at this table. But as she's sitting at this table, being launched onto high society, what is she thinking about? Where's her mind going? Well, it tells us in verse 12, as the king sits at his table, my spikenard, which is again, it's a fragrance that she's wearing, sends forth the smell thereof. And she says, a bundle of myrrh is my well-beloved unto me. He shall lie all night betwixt my breasts. Now, what's going on here? Well, a bundle of myrrh or spikenard, and here's just a picture of an Egyptian painting of a woman perfuming herself. This is very common in the ancient world, especially with the higher class, those who could afford spikenard and myrrh, etc. But it was a way for them to provide fragrance for themselves. And here's an example of an Egyptian painting where this woman is actually, it's actually a wax sort of headgear that is fragrant, and she's actually perfuming herself. She's wearing that. Now, whether they would wear that in public or in private is sometimes debated, but nonetheless, what Shulamite is referencing, it says she's wearing a bundle of myrrh betwixt her breasts. In other words, it's probably a necklace where she has a bundle of myrrh. Sometimes they would wear this in public. Sometimes they would wear this in private. They would go to sleep, and they would sleep with spices. Only those who could afford doing this. They would sleep with spices in order to perfume their body and to smell nice. Well, notice the imagery. Shulamite is sitting in a public setting with the king, sitting at the king's table. But she says, you know what? The smell, the fragrance that she's wearing from that bundle of myrrh that's probably being worn around her neck as a necklace. She says, I wish this was Solomon. Right? I can't wait till he could lie all night betwixt my breasts. What is she saying? She's describing a desire for closeness and intimacy. She wants to be with Solomon. She wants to hug Solomon. She wants to cuddle with Solomon. She wants to be with Solomon. They're in this public scene, this public setting. But where's her mind? Similar to what it was in chapter 1. She's over, or earlier in chapter 1, verses 2 to 4 there. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. She's longing for time with Solomon, closeness, intimacy. Again, similar to what we saw there, where she likened Solomon's character to ointment. Here, she's likening Solomon to the bundle of myrrh. The point is, she views Solomon as valuable. She views him as the most important thing in her life, and she is longing for that closeness and intimacy with Solomon. That's what's going on. Well, then, in the next verse, in verse 14, she makes another analogy. She says, my beloved is unto me as a cluster of campfire in the vineyards of En-gedi. Now, the campfire is, or sometimes it's translated in some translations, henna blossoms. It's a type of flower that's located in the region of En-gedi. Now, as you can see up on the screen, En-gedi right here is an oasis that is right next to the Dead Sea. In fact, this picture right here is a picture of the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is a total moonscape. Everything around it, because of the salt in the sea, the Dead Sea, the high mineral concentration, whenever the winds blow, it basically serves as a poison to the soil everywhere around the Dead Sea. And this is why you have this basically moonscape here. There's nothing in the region of the Dead Sea. That's why it's called dead. Nothing grows there. Well, if you can see on this picture, right about here, if you were to climb up into the rocks right off of the Dead Sea, then you would uncover a natural oasis. There is, as you can see in this picture, there is a natural waterfall that comes from a spring that explodes right out of the side of a rock. And it spills down into a lagoon, as you can see here, and there is rich vegetation all around there. In fact, the term En-gedi is, in Hebrew, means the spring of the wild goat. And there's wildlife, there's all sorts of life that is right there in this oasis in the desert. And the point that you should get from this is when Shulamite likens Solomon to that cluster of henna blossoms or campfire in the regions of En-gedi, she's making another analogy. It's a way of poetically describing her feelings and view of Solomon. But she is viewing him as, and I kind of get out of this two big ideas. Number one, safety, and really you could even say beauty and refreshment, is because when you think about it, if you were walking through this region, and by the way, we could get lost in this, Solomon's daddy, David, is actually a guy who ran for 10 years of his life. He was running from King Saul. After that, he was a fugitive on a number of other occasions. But the Bible says that during his fugitive years, Solomon's father, David, actually hid out in En-gedi. This was one of his reprieves as he was fleeing from King Saul. The point is, it's an area when you have all this moonscape, just dead, nothing is there. But then all of a sudden you stumble upon this oasis of incredible beauty. It's a wonderful, you can hike there even to this day, but it's a wonderful place of refreshment because it's hot around the Dead Sea. But as you get close to that waterfall, you feel the beauty or the relief of the falls and the water that's hitting the air. It's kind of a natural swamp cooler, if you will. You have the beauty of the vegetation all around you, and it's an oasis. It's somewhere where you could survive in the midst of that wilderness. Well, Shulamite likens her relationship to Solomon like this place. She says, you are to me like a henna, group of henna blossoms in En-gedi. The point is, you are my place of safety, my place of refreshment and joy. You're beautiful. You contrast everybody else. You see, she's again using a poetic way, a metaphor, to describe the way that she views Solomon. And the more you understand of that cultural background and what En-gedi actually is, the more vivid that imagery becomes. Boy, is that fun food for thought, meditation material there. But now notice in verse 15 of the text, chapter 1, verse 15, after she has been speaking for several verses, now Solomon responds. Verse 15, he says, behold, you are fair, my love. Behold, you are fair. You have dove's eyes. Now, this is a fascinating comment because he, in response to her compliments towards him, he responds with a compliment, verse 15. Well, then she's going to respond again in verse 16 and 17 in chapter 2, verse 1. And we'll talk about that. But notice the healthy interchange, the exchanging of compliments. There's good chemistry going on here. They're swapping compliments. They're saying nice things about each other, etc. Well, in verse 15, Solomon likens Shulamite to, he just describes her beauty. He says, "You are fair, you're beautiful, my love." And then he repeats it for emphasis, "Behold, you are fair." And then he says, "You have dove's eyes." Now, just to make a quick comment on this, we not to get lost, but what does he mean when he says you have dove's eyes? Well, try not to think there that she, that's a literal description how she has tiny little black, dark beady eyes that dart back and forth. That's probably not what he's getting at, okay? That's not it's a compliment. And what is involved in this compliment? Well, what ideas throughout the Bible are associated with a dove? There's lots of ideas. We could start from Noah's Ark in the very beginning of the Bible, all the way to the dove descending upon Jesus at his baptism. And the point is, throughout the Bible, doves are often associated with images such as innocence, beauty, honesty. In other words, it's a reference, yes, perhaps to her physical beauty, because that's the context. He says in verse 15, "You're fair, my love. Behold, you're fair. You're beautiful. You have dove's eyes." So it could be a way of referencing her physical beauty. Absolutely. But also, I think, it's a way of referencing her innocence and honesty. And the very fact that he's commenting on her eyes, I think, is important. Most cultures throughout time have made some sort of reference, and you've probably heard of the proverbial statement, that the eyes are the window to the soul. The eyes are the window to the soul. And one of the greatest ways that you can communicate to someone is through eye contact, where you are focusing on the eyes of an individual. When you can hold genuine, deep, good eye contact, it's actually a means to communicate honesty, transparency, innocence. You have nothing to hide. Easy way to illustrate this is if you have kids, or if you have a pet, like maybe a dog often does this, and when a child or a pet is in trouble, and they're afraid, they're fearful, what do? They rarely look you in the eyes. They're always looking down. They're avoiding eye contact. Why? Because they're full of shame or a fear or some similar emotion. The point is, eye contact is, in many ways, a window to the soul. And if you remember your dating stage, boy, we used to talk about this at college. At college, I was an RA, resident assistant. One of my jobs was to make sure that there was no inappropriate behavior going on. I was at a school where there were several rules on how to behave properly in a public setting, in living up to Christian ideals. Well, one of my jobs was to make sure the couples around campus were being appropriate. And so it was kind of funny, but most, these couples who could not, have physical displays of emotion in public, nonetheless, they would sit across one another at a desk or at a table, and they would just stare longingly into one another's eyes for just inordinate amounts of time. And we used to, at the RAs, used to joke one to another, and we used to say that there they are making eye babies. They're staring each other down. And the point is, that's about all that they could do in public at the school that I was at. But the point is, there's in the puppy love stage, in that pursuit stage, there is good, long, healthy eye contact. You're communicating to each other. You're showing affection to each other. But so often, as your relationship develops, perhaps you get married, perhaps then your relationship stagnates a little bit. Now, that quality time of long eye contact, trying to understand one another, communicate, see into the soul of each other, you tend to let that take a back seat in your relationship. And as a result, it often lead to an erosion in the relationship. And we'll talk about this more as we go because it's illustrated for us in chapter 5 of the book. But nonetheless, I think it's important to highlight that now. Well, then what happens? Verse 16, notice Shulamite responds to Solomon and says this, "Behold, you are fair, my beloved, yea, pleasant Also, our bed is green. Verse 17, the beams of our house are cedar and the rafters are fir. So he responds to her compliments, verse 15. Now she responds back to his compliment, verse 16 and 17. Notice the good communication. They're talking to each other. Really important here. Well, notice verse 16, she essentially repeats the compliment that he made to her, and then she elaborates on it a little bit. She says, yes, behold, you're fair. He called her fair, now she calls him fair. She says, well, right back at you, buddy. You're good looking. And then she says, yea, you're also pleasant. That word is referencing not simply the outer beauty and looks of Solomon, but the fact that he's pleasant to be around. It's a reference to his personality, his gentleness, his honesty, his character. So she's complimenting his looks, his character. But then she says, our bed is green, the beams of our house are cedar, and our rafters are fir. What is she referencing here? Well, there's really two ways to take these phrases. First of all, some take this very literally, that maybe they're out on a picnic and they're lying down on the green grass. Our bed is green, and they're looking up through the trees. The rafters are of fir. That could be. That could very well be the case. And so it's another picture of kind of, quality time that they're spending together. Or the other way to take this, which, personally I'm tempted to take it this way, only because we know from other passages in 1 Kings that Solomon was a builder, and he was an architect. He was a brilliant architect in some ways, and one of his primary building materials were the cedars from Lebanon. And the point that might be made here is that Solomon is actually, in anticipation of their marriage, Solomon is actually preparing, because we know from Jewish culture and history that this was the responsibility of the man, was to prepare a place, a house for them to live in after they get married. That might be what's being referenced here, in which case she is basically proud of the fact that Solomon is building a brand new bed for them. Our bed is green, and the idea is green wood. It's brand new. Or verse 17, the beams of our house, the dwelling place that he is preparing for her, are of cedar, and rafters are of fir. Both of those are fine woods. They would be imported to the city of Jerusalem. But what's fascinating also is that if that's the case, and this is actually talking about architecture that Solomon is building for her, then the cedars of Lebanon, which are pretty famous in the ancient world, we have them referenced inside and outside the Bible. But don't forget, where is Shulamite from? She's from Lebanon. And so the very fact that he would be building for her a house out of the cedars from Lebanon, where is he building the house? Jerusalem. Where's the wood coming from? Lebanon. So it could be a way, because remember, she's uncomfortable in Jerusalem. She's a fish out of water. This isn't a foreign place for her. But maybe him taking the steps to import the wood from Lebanon, to build a house out of wood from her backyard, is something that is basically showing a sensitive side to Solomon. He's trying to do what he can to reinforce her insecurities, to address those, both with words, by calling her beautiful, by describing her in that way, but also in his actions, his act of service, in building a house for her. He's displaying his ability to provide for her, to be sensitive to her needs, and to provide a place of security for her. As we'll see, later in chapter 2 and 3, her safe place is her home up in Lebanon. But he is asking her to leave that and come and live with him down in Jerusalem, and she's a little nervous about that. But nonetheless, he's doing what he can to address those insecurities with provision and sensitivity. It's really a profound observation if you think about it. Well, what happens next? In chapter 2, verse 1, she then responds, she's continuing, and she says, I am the rose of Sharon and the lily of the valleys. I am the rose of Sharon and the lily of the valleys. Now, the rose of Sharon is referencing just a type of flower that was common, and if you can see here on the screen, the plain of Sharon, or Sharon, is right down here in ancient Israel, even modern Israel for that matter. And what's fascinating is, even to this day, this region is one of the perfect temperaments for growing flowers. Israel, in fact, even modern Israel, grows more flowers than Holland. Israel grows so many flowers, they ship flowers to Holland. It's a rather profound thing. But the point is, Shulamite here is likening herself to a rose on the plain of Sharon, or a lily among the valley. And what's, I think, important about this is a comment Shulamite is making about herself. But it dramatically contrasts the comment she made about herself back in chapter 1, verse 6, where she's defending her beauty before the daughters of Jerusalem. She says, I'm black, but comely. She feels the need to defend her beauty. And the point is, we talked about how often that, the outward beauty of a woman is one of the greatest areas of insecurity for a woman. But the fact is, Solomon has been just lavishing upon her compliment after compliment after compliment. He is so prolific in giving her compliments and just asserting her beauty and affirming her, that chapter 2, verse 1 may well be evidence of the fact that she is, as I say there on the screen, beginning to view herself through Solomon's eyes. In other words, her insecurities about her own beauty are beginning to diminish. Why? Because Solomon is being so careful and sensitive and consistent in affirming her beauty in his eyes. So much so that she is beginning to view herself that way. She's growing in confidence. That's the point. That's a pretty profound observation of how when we treat our wives, gentlemen, when we treat our wives appropriately, in a godly way, how that gives them the right soil in which to bloom and blossom into confident women that are secure in our love. That's an interesting thought. But notice how Solomon takes it a step further. In verse 2, he says, this is now, Shulamite spoke verse 1, now verse 2 is Solomon speaking. Notice what he says, as the lily among the thorns, so is my love among the daughters. In other words, she says, I'm like a lily of the valley. He says, no. You're not a lily in the middle of a field of lilies. No, he says, you are like the lily in the middle of thorns. In other words, Solomon is saying, no, you're not just one among many, but you are one of a kind. That you're not just one lily amongst a whole field of other lilies. You're just one woman out there and there's many fish in the sea. No. He says, no, you are the lily in the middle of thorns. All those other women out there, they're nothing but thorns. You are the beautiful one. You're peerless. You're unique. Now, this brings up an interesting lesson for us, is, when, gentlemen, and women, it applies to you, but when you compliment your spouse, how do you do it? Do you say, well, you know what, you're doing all right, but, and then you compare them to other people around you, and you say, I really think you should probably be more like that woman, or that guy, and the point is, whenever you do that, whenever you compare your spouse with another person, what are you doing? You may not intend to do this, and you might just be stupid, and you're doing it, without meaning it, or you're actually doing it on purpose. Shame on you. But you're trying to undermine their confidence. The point is, either way, when you do that, when all you do is talk about other people and around your spouse, and you are, even in public, I mean, don't ever do this. But when you compare your spouse to someone else, what you're basically saying to your spouse is you're not good enough. I don't like you the way that you are. I wish you were more like such and such, or so and so. And when you do that, you are actually blaring with a megaphone, whether you realize it or not. That's why I'm telling you this. You are blaring with a megaphone that you are not satisfied with your spouse, that your spouse is not enough, that you really wish they were something else or someone else. And when you do that, you are undermining the security of your relationship. You will eventually cause your own relationship to implode. Don't do it. Solomon, on the other hand, he says, you know what? No, I have eyes for only you. And I'm looking only at you. Those other women, they don't have my attention. They're thorns. A thorn. They're dangerous. They're short-lived. They're worthless. You are my one and only. My friends, boy, gentlemen, we could really get lost here talking about pornography, couldn't we? If you have wandering eyes and you're looking at every other woman except for your wife, what do you think that does to her confidence? Do you think she feels beautiful? Do you think she wants to have intimacy with you? No, because what are you doing? You are expressing your desire and lust after every other woman except for your wife. You're shooting yourself in the foot, let me tell you. You're driving a wedge in your relationship. Don't do it. Profound, isn't it? Hurts. Well, what happens next? Let's read verses 3 to 5, because what is so beautiful here is he likens her to not just, no, you're not one among many, you're one of a kind. And so she responds in like manner. Notice this, how beautiful this is, the good chemistry going on. Verse 3, she says, as the apple tree among the trees of the wood, so is my beloved among the sons. I sat down under his shadow with great delight, and his fruit was sweet to my taste. He brought me to the banqueting house, and his banner over me was love. Stay me with flagons, comfort me with apples, for I am sick of love, or love sick, smitten, she says. His left hand is under my head, and his right hand doth embrace me. Now, what's going on in these verses? Verses 3 to 6 there. Is she is basically doing what he just did to her. He compliments her and says, no, you're not just one of a kind. You are, or excuse me, one among many. You are one of a kind. Well, now she's doing the same thing. She's just using a different image. He says, he's using the metaphor of a lily amongst thorns. She's using the metaphor of an apple tree among the trees of the wood. In other words, she says, you are not just one of the trees in the forest. You are like that one unique tree that when you stumble upon it, it has apples. It's an apple tree. And the point is, she says, you are like this, and I sat down under your shadow, and with great delight. Because an apple tree is different than any other tree, because yes, it casts shade like all the other trees, but it has fruit. It's not just a source of protection from the heat and the sun, but it's also a source of provision. You can actually eat it. And then it's a source of pleasure. It's sweet. It's enjoyable. Apples are good. And so she says, you are sweet to my taste. And I think this is fascinating, especially in the fact that if you contrast this with what was said earlier in chapter 1, what did she, if you recall this, what was the sun, the hot sun, a metaphor for in chapter 1, verses 5 and 6? Do you remember that? She likened the hot sun to the gaze of the daughters of Jerusalem that were making her, Shulamite, insecure. She felt insecure and fearful when she tried to measure up with the women around her. Well, as she felt that way, think how profound this is. The love that Solomon is showering upon her is giving her security, shade from those gazing eyes of the daughters of Jerusalem. In other words, Solomon is so good at affirming his love for Shulamite that she's feeling safe. She's feeling loved, protected, provided for. And notice, it says in verse 5, she says, stay me with flagons, comfort me with apples, for I am smitten with love. In other words, she says, oh, I can't get enough of this. She just can't get enough of eating these apples and spending time with Solomon and being beneath the safety of his love and affirmation. Guys, this is important for us to learn. Our women thrive in an environment of security, love, protection, and provision. That's what we're supposed to do and provide for our women. But when we don't do that, when we are lazy or we are stupid and we don't provide that sort of environment for our wives, we are stripping from them what is one of their greatest needs and most important things. And we are setting them up for failure. Well, notice a couple more observations here. Verse 4, she says, he brought me to the banqueting house and his banner over me was love. This is referencing the banqueting house would be it's actually, Hebrew is house of wine. It's probably referring to a public place. It's basically akin to what you and I would consider a nice, fine dining date, where he's treating her nice. He's taking her out. And she likens this to a banner over her screaming love. She says, the way you treat me is convincing me you really love me. Do you see how important that is? The way we treat one another does send a signal that either I love you or I don't care about you. Whether you realize it or not, everything you say and everything you do is ultimately going to be sending one of those two signals. And the problem is, most of the time, we have a marriage that begins to disintegrate. Why? Because we stop sending the right signals. We stop communicating our affection one to another. Verse 6 is referencing a good snuggle moment. She says, his left hand is under my head, his right hand doth embrace me. She feels safe in his warm embrace. Now, what happens then in verse 7? All right, let me wrap this up, and then we're going to make some practical application, and I'm going to assign you your homework for this week. But notice chapter 2, verse 7, where she says, I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the roes and by the hinds of the field, that you stir not up, nor awake my love, or passion love, until the time is right, until it pleases. Now, this phrase in verse 7 is the first of 5 choruses that we're going to see throughout the book. I'm not going to get lost in this, but again, this is a song, the Song of Songs. Like modern, songs, it has a chorus. It has a repeated refrain that keeps going throughout the book. And this repeated refrain has a very clear set of emphases, things it's emphasizing. And here is the big 3 ideas. And we can camp on this for a long time. I'm just going to try and summarize it. But the big ideas that are encapsulated in this verse is passion, purity, patience, or as I put it there, purity, patience, and passion. In other words, read it again. She says, I charge you. Now, what's unique about this chorus is it's Shulamite speaking, but she's speaking not to Solomon, but to the daughters of Jerusalem, onlookers, people who are daughters of Jerusalem, virgins, that are not yet married. And she, as Shulamite, is experiencing this love relationship with Solomon. She is giving them a piece of advice on how to conduct a proper relationship. And I think it's fascinating because it's also we who are reading this. We are part of the audience, if you will, listening to this song. And so we are essentially being challenged by this chorus. And it's more than just advice. She says, I charge you, O you daughters of Jerusalem. It's a very strong phrase, and it means way more than, hey, I'm just making a suggestion here. No, the word charge literally means to place you under oath. It's more than just advice. It's like a stern warning. It's like, please make this commitment. I charge you to do what? Well, she says, by the roes and by the hinds of the field, which in ancient Near Eastern poetic speak were basically the way that we view rabbits. They're kind of, fertility symbols. She says, by the roes and the hinds of the field, do not stir up or arouse passion until it's appropriate. In other words, I think first of all, the lesson here is, can we long for passion, especially during the dating stage, before we make a commitment to marriage? Can we long for passion, sexual intimacy, before it's appropriate? Yes. Can we step over the boundaries if we're not careful? Because what does God say? Can we have sex before marriage? No. I don't care what your society says. I don't care what culture says. I don't care what Hollywood says. They're all wrong. Okay, so there. The Bible says that we must maintain sexual purity, both before marriage and then in marriage only to our spouse. That's the way the Bible says. And by the way, it's the best way to live. There is study after study after study. I could bore you with this, that have confirmed what the Bible has always said. The happiest, most sexually satisfied people are people who are in a faithful monogamous marriage. That is sexual bliss. Hollywood's going to lie to you and say, no, it's all the guy who has the most sexual conquests. That's the guy who's happiest. No, that's a lie. That does not work. Same for women. People say, well, maybe the grass is greener on the other side. I want to try it there. I want to try it here. No, don't do it. Do not do it, because it will only bring frustration, sexual frustration, guilt, shame, etc. Don't do it. She's saying, be sexually pure. Yes, enjoy passion, but only when the time is right. Only within the confines of marriage where God says. So be patient. True love waits for marriage and stays only in the bonds of marriage. But I think there's another interesting point to be made here, and then we'll move on, is she says, don't arouse love until the time is right. In other words, yes, we could talk about that in the realm of passion, and I think it's obviously talking about that. But I think there's something else. We'll talk about it more when we get to chapter 8, but can love, by its very nature, love is something that is voluntary. You have to give love to someone else. You can't buy love. You can't bribe someone into loving you. It doesn't work that way. Love, by definition, is voluntary. And the point is, if we are doing things right, if we are doing what God says, and we are showing affection to our spouses properly, we are serving one another consistently, then love happens. It's the environment in which, the soil in which love blooms and blossoms and grows. But if you're not doing it God's way, you can't force someone to love you. And sometimes people think that they can bribe someone into loving them, and as a result, they trying to force the relationship. And you can't do it. It says it has to happen. Love is aroused when the time is right. In other words, you need to be doing what God says we need to be doing, and love is the result of that. True love is a result of that. It's not something that can be forced. You can't push someone. And here's the thing. Many of you who are listening to this course are at a point where your marriage is in trouble. Like, if this doesn't work, you're going to get a divorce. It's over. You're done. And sometimes there's one spouse who really wants to save the marriage, the other one's not so sure. And if you are in a place where you are trying to force that spouse to stay, now should they stay? Yes. Should they work it out? Yes. But can you make that happen? No. Maybe you are at this point in your relationship because you have not been doing what we're reading. You have not had healthy chemistry in your marriage for years. Basically, you're a jerk. And as a result, you have a cold heart in your spouse. Your spouse they just don't believe you love them anymore. And so you can't force them to just turn around and want to save this marriage overnight. You have to change, and you have to start living differently. You have to start showing affection toward your spouse. And in time, their heart will be warmed, and true affection can once again be stirred. Does that make sense? Do you see what I'm trying to say? So how do we do that? Let me summarize. And let me just make a quick book recommendation. You don't have to get this. I'm going to give you the gist of the book anyways. But if you are interested and you're kind of one of those, overachievers, good for you. I'm just going to quickly summarize, and then this is your homework assignment, and then we'll be done for today. The 5 Love Languages by Gary Chapman is a fascinating book. And all he does in this is he defines the 5 basic ways, and it's not an exhaustive list, but it's a very helpful list. It's a help for me. I use it all the time. It's a helpful template to look at. And he's just listing the 5 most common ways to show and receive, to send and receive affection one towards another. And maybe you're familiar with this. If you are, great. If not, buckle up, because this is new information, but it's vital information. It's a good measuring stick to see, how am I doing when it comes to this area of showing affection to my spouse? Well, how do you show affection to your spouse? 5 things, all right? Here they are. Number 1, words of affirmation. How about you just say, I love you. You're beautiful. Wow, you look nice today. Give a compliment. Verbal affirmation. Number 2, quality time. Spend time. As she says, where's your flocks at noon? Let's get together. Let's spend time. Let's gaze into one another's eyes. Let's talk deeply about our goals, our emotions, our feelings, our struggles, our fears. Let's talk. Number 3, receiving gifts. Gift giving. Now, sometimes people go overboard and they think this is the only thing, and I don't have to do any of the other 4 as long as I just bribe them with lots of gifts. Doesn't work that way. Doesn't work that way. Showing affection really needs to be all 5 of these. But gift giving. Number 4, acts of service. Doing something for your spouse. Doing something. Making dinner. Washing dishes. Mowing the lawn. Fixing the car. Right? Planning a getaway. Whatever. Playing with the kids. Do something that communicates to your spouse that you love them. And then number 5, physical touch. Hold their hand. Rub their back. Give them a kiss. Physical touch. All right, these are the 5 ways that we send and receive affection. Now, notice all of these are in this section we just read. I'm not going to go back and rehearse it all. We just walked through it. But did those pop out at you? Did you see those? The good chemistry between Solomon and Shulamite during this pursuit stage, as they're developing their love relationship one with another, involve all 5 of these love languages. Words of affirmation. They're calling each other by titles of endearment. They say, "Oh, thou whom my soul loves. Oh, thou fairest among women." They're using titles of endearment, terms of endearment. They're saying, "Oh, you're beautiful. Oh, you're pleasant. Oh, you're a lily among the thorns." Words of affirmation. They're speaking compliments to one another. Number 2, quality time. She says, "Where are you going to be at noon? I got to be there." In chapter 2, or that's chapter 1, verse 7. Chapter 2, verse 4, they're spending time at the banqueting house together. The point is, they're spending quality time together. Number 3, gift giving. Right? He says, "We will make you studs of gold with, borders of gold with studs of silver." He's going to give her gifts. Acts of service. Again, chapter 1, verse 17. If he's building a house for her, he is displaying by what he's doing the fact that he loves her and he wants to provide safety and security for her. And then physical touch. She is longing for the kisses of his mouth. Chapter 1, verses 2 to 4. In verse 13, she's longing to hold him all night. In chapter 2, verse 6, they're having a cuddle moment. "His left hand is under my head, his right hand doth embrace me." They're snuggling. The point is, they are sending and receiving all these signs of affection. Now think about this. This is what you need to do. Now I'm getting into the homework stage before we shut her down and we call it good for this session. But whether you realize this or not, everyone has their own love language. Now, to be fair, we probably have more than one. All of us, we should, listen to me now, we should be showing our affection in all 5 of these ways. All 5. However, typically the way we're built is that there's 1 or 2 of them that are our favorite. That really, like my wife, she loves gift giving. Like when I give her a gift, it means the world to her. When she gives me one, I appreciate it, but it doesn't mean as much to me as it does to her. Gift giving is like one of her love languages. To me, boy, physical touch. She comes up behind me and gives me a hug. That does it for me. You know what I'm saying? That means a lot to me. And the point is, we all are a little bit different in how we prefer to show and receive affection. Do you have any idea what your spouse's love language is? Could you right now name them off? If not, this is what you need to do. Here's your homework. Number 1, review the list. What are the 5 love languages? Review the list. Number 2, speak to your spouse. Sit down, talk it over. Say, "Hey, what is your preferred love language? Like, what means the most to you?" And then identify your top 2. Now, again, like I said, you really should be practicing all 5 regularly, but identify your top 2. What is it that means the most to your spouse? How is it? Maybe it's quality time. Maybe it's words of affirmation. Maybe it's act of service, gift giving, physical touch, whichever one it is. Identify your top 2. And then this is what you need to do. Once you identify your top 2 love languages, both spouses, then communicate them to your spouse. Say, "This is mine and what's yours?" Okay. And then communicate this. And then find ways to creatively implement them at least once a day this next week. Just try it. Try to find ways to creatively implement those love languages to your spouse. Because this is what I'm telling you. Most marriages stagnate because they quit pursuing one another. They quit demonstrating and sharing affection one to another. They just stop talking. They stop showing eye contact. They stop displaying affection through hugs or kisses, or and sometimes it doesn't even have to be sexual. It doesn't have to be a sexual advance every time, guys. Just go hug your wife. Snuggle watching a movie. Talk. Maybe you need to turn off the TV and you need to talk to your spouse. Maybe you need to take them on a date. Maybe you need to give them a bouquet of flowers. Give them a gift. Whatever. My friends, we need to be active in pursuing. And that's what's so practical about this stage, is that Solomon and Shulamite, during their pursuit stage, they had healthy chemistry. Boy, it was good. And it was sending and receiving good quality signals that was resulting in a confidence that each other had in their relationship. But, as we'll see in chapter 5, they quit doing that. And as a result, they really hit a hard spot in their marriage, and they got to work through it. And they got to get back to this point of pursuing one another. My friends, we have to take this seriously. This is how we send and receive affection. So, that's your homework. Do you understand? Does that make sense? All right, so get those, have that talk it through, write it down. I'm kind of a big write it down guy. Write down your top love languages. Write down how you are going to display those this week, and then implement it. All right? That's our goal. Let's close in prayer. Father, thank you so much for the time today. Thank you, Lord, for this precious, precious opportunity to get into your word, to examine what it is your word has to say about relationships. Lord, as we are witnessing the love relationship between Solomon and Shulamite, and we're seeing it develop, we ask that, Lord, you would give us wisdom and insight into not only what worked for them, but how you designed marriage to be and how we ought to implement these things in our marriages for your glory. God bless, I pray, as these couples go through this, as they try to identify their love language, that of their spouse. They try to implement, Lord, showing affection in these ways, all so that we can live lives for your glory, that we can enjoy marriage the way you designed it to be. So God, bless these efforts. Help us, Lord, to communicate clearly and honestly one to another, and that you would help us to invest and strengthen our marriages. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Lord bless you all, and can't wait to tune in next time.